Talk about the election of 1872. It was an interesting election because President Grant is going to want to run for re-election on the part of the Republican Party, but there are people within the Republican Party that really don't like this corruption and scandal that's happened during his administration. And so this group of reform-minded Republicans, and those would be Republicans that like change. If you like reform, you like change. A group of reform-minded Republicans split off from the regular Republican Party, and they started a new political party called the Liberal Republican Party, which is self-explanatory. They were Republicans that were considered liberals, and they wanted to see change or reform because they were upset with the scandals that had gone on during the Grant presidency. So in 1872, a varied group of reform-minded Republicans who were tired of the Grant scandals formed the Liberal Republican Party. They were simply Republicans who wanted to see change. The man they nominated for president was Horace Greeley. Kind of an interesting choice. He was simply the editor of the New York Tribune. He did not have a lot of political experience, but obviously he had reported on political matters. But he was the editor of the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley. And he simply ran on a platform of cleaning up the corruption and scandal in federal government. That's what he campaigned on. That if he was elected, he would clean up this scandal and corruption. Now, anytime you have a split in a Republican Party, or a Democratic Party, or any party for that matter, who does the advantage go to? The other party. Now, this is where the Democrats did something I think kind of ingenious, but it didn't work out, surprisingly. Guess who the Democrats nominated for president? Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune. So, think about that. If you're a Democrat, does that seem to your advantage? All of your people are going to vote for him, and then you're going to get the liberal wing of the Republican Party to vote for him because they nominated him too. So big time advantage, you would think, to the Democratic Party because they're nominating the same guy that the people that are disenchanted with Grant are nominating. So you should win this election easily if you think about it, because you've split the other party and then you got the same candidate. Well, amazingly enough, Grant destroys Greeley in this election. It was kind of amazing. Grant ended up with 286 electoral votes to Greeley's 66. 286 to 66. So despite the split in the Republican Party, President Grant was reelected by a really large margin, 286 to 66. What does this tell you about people in America at the time? What's that? Say what? They liked Grant, for one thing, despite the scandals they were willing to overlook that, and also they weren't really ready for change, okay? Because the Democrats were going to change, the liberal Republicans were going to change, and when people really went to the polls, they told you that they weren't ready for change. They were okay with Grant. He's had a few scandals, but we really liked the guy. Now, so he remains pretty popular during the 4 years he served his first term, right? And then they even kind of like him for 2 more years. But these midterm elections, what happens is congressmen are elected for 2 years and senators 6. So they don't match up with 4 every time, so we have midterm elections. And in 1874, we had midterm elections, not where you're electing a president, but you're electing members of Congress. And the point I'm making is in those midterm elections in 1874, who gained control of Congress? The Democrats. So it began to tell you that, you know, Grant's popularity lasted about 6 years. In the last 2 years of his presidency, his second term, things weren't so great. He had a Democratic-controlled Congress, and his popularity really went down the tubes. Now we're going to finish the test material with a profile on Ulysses S. Grant. Kind of an interesting guy because you know him as this wonderful, successful man who led us to victory, if you're in the North, in the Civil War. Well, he didn't always have such a great things happening for him, so we'll kind of get into that. Actually, I'll tell you this. Do you know that Ulysses S. Grant was not born Ulysses S. Grant? He was born Hiram Ulysses Grant. And he was born on April 27th of 1822 in Georgetown, Ohio. So Ulysses S. Grant was actually born Hiram Ulysses Grant, and he was born on April 27, 1822 in Georgetown, Ohio. So Ulysses S. Grant was actually born Hiram Ulysses Grant, and he was born on April 27, 1822, thank you dear, in Georgetown, Ohio. Now, I'm just going to refer to him as Hiram because that's his name up to this point. Hiram Ulysses Grant was the oldest of 6 children. He had 2 brothers and 3 sisters, but he was the oldest. So the family consisted of 3 boys and 3 girls, him being the oldest. So he had 2 brothers and 3 sisters, and he was the oldest of 6 children. And his father owned and operated a tannery business. His father owned and operated a tannery business. Anybody know what a tannery business? What do you do in a tannery business?
Hides.
Tan hides and turn the hides into what? Leather goods, etc. So his father owned a tannery business, and he grew up with 2 brothers and 3 sisters. Well, he went to elementary school in Georgetown, and then he went to junior high in Georgetown, and then he graduates from high school in 1839 from Georgetown. So he spends his whole educational career in Georgetown, Ohio, graduating in 1839. Well, during his senior year, towards the end of his senior year, his father heard rumor that their neighbor's son got dismissed from the United States Military Academy at West Point. So, in the latter stages of Grant's high school career, Grant's father hears rumor that their neighbor's son has been dismissed from the United States Military Academy in West Point. Evidently got too many demerits and got the boots. So what Hiram Grant's father did is he went to the local congressman and said, hey, would you support my son taking the spot of my neighbor's son who just got dismissed from West Point? Would you support him and appoint him as the replacement? So Hiram Grant's father hears that their neighbor's son had been dismissed from West Point. He goes to his local congressman and asks the congressman to support his son taking that person's spot. And the congressman agreed to do so. And when the congressman, this is the story, when the congressman fills out the paperwork to get him into West Point, he makes a clerical error and refers to him as Ulysses S. Grant. Okay? So when the congressman puts in the paperwork for Hiram Ulysses Grant to go to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, he makes a clerical error on the form and he puts Ulysses S. Grant. Well, Ulysses S. Grant, especially he and his father, were concerned that if they said, hey, his name is Hiram, that it would screw up the process. So they legally changed his name to Ulysses S. Grant to make sure that that West Point appointment didn't get screwed up on that clerical error. They thought it would be easier to change his name than try to get the paperwork fixed. So they might have been right. So he changed his name legally at that point to Ulysses S. Grant. Kind of an interesting story. Well, see if some of this rings a bell. At West Point, Grant was listed as an average student. Wasn't a great student, wasn't a horrible student. Pretty average. And he did receive several demerits. What's a demerit? You have demerits in anything you're in? Little Scouts or whatever? What are demerits?
Like an award or...
It's the opposite of an award. It's if you screw up, they give you so many, they give you a demerit or a... And if you get so many demerits, probably what happened to the guy replaced, you get the boots. What do you think he got his demerits for? Well, I'll tell you, one was tardiness. He couldn't get anywhere on time, so he got several demerits for tardiness. But I think the other thing he received demerits for might make sense to you. because you've heard about this to a point, and I would think when we talked about this before, you would have been a little bit surprised by Grant's actions here. He got demerits for untidy dress. Now, where was he the most untidy at the most important time? At Appomattox. Remember, he wore a private shirt unbuttoned and muddy boots. He wasn't a fancy dresser, evidently, and it went all the way back to West Point when he received many demerits for untidy dress and tardiness. So I guess it shouldn't be a surprise that he didn't dress up like Lee did at the surrender at Appomattox. So what did he do good at the military academy? According to historians, he was very good in mathematics. He was very good at geology and very good at horsemanship. Three things he really shined in were mathematics, geology, and horsemanship. He eventually graduated in 1843. Ranked 21st out of a class of 39. So he was in the bottom 50th percentile, right? 21 times 2 is 42. 39 in the class. So he was in the bottom 50th percentile. 21st out of 39. And what happens when you graduate? Do you come out a private first class? No, you come out a commissioned officer. And depending how well you do is the rank you earn. And when he left West Point, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant. That's the rank he came out of West Point with. Second lieutenant. And after you get done coming out of West Point and get your rank, what do they do then? They do. You go home? No. They assign you somewhere under the command of someone, right? So he comes out with a commission of second lieutenant, and he was assigned to the 4th Infantry Regiment, 4th United States Infantry Regiment, which was stationed near St. Louis, Missouri. So he comes out of West Point, he's given a commission of second lieutenant, that's his rank, and he gets assigned to the 4th United States Infantry Regiment, which was stationed at the time near St. Louis, Missouri. That's his first assignment. And during the time that he spends in St. Louis, he meets his future wife, Julia Dent. So during the time that he's in St. Louis serving, he meets his future wife, Julia Dent. And he proposes to her, ladies, in 1844. He proposes to her in 1844. Well, before they could get married, he got shipped off, because what war is going on in 1844-45 that he's going to be fighting in? Couldn't be the Civil War, because that was 1861-ish. What's the war we fought? Remember the Alamo? Mexican War, yeah. The Mexican War had broken out, and so before he could get married to Julia Dent, he was shipped off for duty in the Mexican War. His job in the Mexican War, he was a quartermaster. Quartermaster. I was amazed somebody in the other class actually knew what this was. Anybody know what a quartermaster does in the Army? No, good guess. It's a good guess, but not right. What's a quartermaster do?
Does it have to do with like their room?
Their what?
Their room?
No. A quartermaster is someone that organizes supplies that are sent back and forth to regiments and troops in the field, etc. So a quartermaster is someone that oversees the movement of supplies between regiments, etc. So he was a supply man, quartermaster. Now, during the time that he was involved in the Mexican War, he served under both General Zachary Taylor and General Winfield Scott. So he was under some good commanders. So during his time in the Mexican War, Ulysses S. Grant served under both General Zachary Taylor, who we've talked about, and General Winfield Scott. Well, After the Mexican War ends and after they've been engaged for 4 years, Ulysses and Julia were finally married in 1848. And over the next 6 years after their marriage, they had 4 children. So after a 4-year engagement, Ulysses and Julia were finally married in 1848. And over the next 6 years after their marriage, they eventually had 4 children. Well, he's still in the military, so after the Mexican War, he's going to get another assignment. And this is going to be right after he gets married and right after his wife gives birth to their first son. And he's assigned to Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory. So after the Mexican War, after he's been married now and his wife's given birth to their first son, he gets assigned to Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory. Where's his wife staying? Where are they living? St. Louis. Now, in those days, you couldn't take your families with you, so he's going to be clear over in the Oregon Territory, and she's going to be in St. Louis, and they're going to be apart during this time that he is serving. And she was actually pregnant when he left for Fort Vancouver, so during the time that he's there, she's going to give birth to a second son. And he's going to be away from his wife and now 2 children during his stint at Fort Vancouver. So after the Mexican War, Grant was assigned to Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory, leaving his wife and infant son behind. The second son was born during the time he served at Fort Vancouver. And he soon became very lonely, got kind of depressed, and how did he handle his loneliness and depression? Popped a cork. Yep. Started drinking pretty heavily. That's where he got his reputation. Popped a cork pretty regularly. Well, in the summer of 1853, he was promoted to the rank of captain and reassigned to Fort Humboldt in Northern California. So in the summer of 1853, he was promoted to the rank of captain and then was transferred to Fort Humboldt in Northern California. Again, without what? His family. Yep, without his family. Well, on July 31st of 1854, after having several run-ins with his commanding officer, he finally had enough of it and resigned from the United States military and went back home to St. Louis. Finally, on July 31st of 1854, after having several run-ins with his superior officer there at Fort Humboldt, he simply grew tired of the military, resigned, and went back to St. Louis. Well, when he got back to St. Louis, his father-in-law gave him a small farm to work and also gave him his own personal slave. So when he returned back, his father-in-law gave him a small farm to work, and even gave him, along with that farm, his own personal slave. So Grant was a slave owner. Well, Grant didn't do very well in his 3 years in the farming business, and finally the farm went under. Okay, so he couldn't make it as a farmer. Farm soon went under. Worked it for a few years and it went under. And this tells you a little bit about Ulysses S. Grant. His slave, whose name was William Jones, what could he have done with that slave when his farm went under? He had 2 things he could have done. Sold him or freed him. Well, Grant didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. He didn't have any money, and he could have got a substantial amount of money if he sold his slave. But he chose not to sell him and freed him instead. So that tells you a little bit about Grant. He could have, really made some substantial money in selling William Jones, and he could have used the money for sure. But he made the choice not to do that and freed the slave William Jones instead. Well, after the failed farm venture, he tried his hand in real estate, the buying and selling of land and property. And he failed at that as well. He wasn't very good at that either. So he tried his hand in real estate, buying and selling of property and land. It didn't work out very well for him. So he applied for a job as an engineer in St. Louis and didn't get the job. Then he applied to be a clerk in a store in St. Louis and didn't get the job. And still having to provide for his family, he was reduced to selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis. Does this sound like the Ulysses S. Grant you've all heard of? He struggled. So he failed in real estate, couldn't get hired as an engineer, couldn't get hired as a store clerk in St. Louis, and finally, to feed his family, was reduced to selling firewood on a St. Louis street. That didn't work very good for him, didn't make enough money. So finally in 1860, you know what he had to go do? What do you think he went and did? What's that? Not yet. He had to go work for his father's tannery business, who by this time in 1860 had turned it over to who? No, his sons, his two younger sons. So he really had to humble himself and go to work for the father's tanning company. And who were his bosses? His younger brothers. Yeah, so that wouldn't be very easy, would it? So finally in 1860, Grant has to humble himself, and he went to work at his father's tannery business. He worked as a clerk there, and he was supervised by his two younger